us about religion and caste in India.
Yeah, thanks so much. Very clear. It's kind of early stage work in terms of like, I hope the first set of results that I'm going to present today are in terms of the thought of the identification strategy and the idea behind it is kind of convincing, but there's work to be done in terms of thinking about the mechanisms. But what's the overarching question in some senses, how does religion have an impact on socioeconomic outcomes, right? And this has been a question that's been kind of looked at in the literature in a variety of ways, right? So, or in the social sciences. So if you think about the work of Weber, and the Protestant ethic, laying down which has been extensively explored in the literature, the work of Sasha Becker and Woosma goes exactly to this question of asking, and what they say, was Weber wrong in looking at, when you look at Protestant and Catholics in 19th century Russia, they find, the Protestants do better. But once you account for human capital differences among these two groups, there are no differences between Protestant and Catholics. And their interpretation is that, yes, indeed, Weber was wrong in terms of the fact that it was nothing inherent about Protestant ethic that changed them, unless you want to interpret Protestant ethic as being encouraging you to uptake more human capital in some sense. And here the title is kind of motivated by the fact that, as we're going to get into this, we're going to look at a particular group in India. They're called the scheduled caste, the group that was formerly subject to the practice of untouchability under the Hindu religion. And clearly, we are interested in asking, and there were waves of conversion starting in the early 20th century where groups opted out of Hinduism precisely because they were stigmatized within their own religion. And Ambedkar, who was the drafter of the Constitution of India, one of the key participants in this process, who also fought for and enshrined affirmative action programs for the former untouchables, also known as Dalits. That's the term in which they self-identify themselves. Was of the opinion in the end that the only way out maybe was to have intercaste marriages. We wanted the institution of caste to endogamy was what was holding them back. And by the end of his life, and we're going to look at it, we're going to kind of draw on his experience. He was of the view that, well, the only thing that was actually left for these groups was to step out of Hinduism to be able to escape the tyranny of the caste system. And so we want to ask, hey, was Ambedkar actually right about it, right? So more generically, why could religion matter? Because they have distinct social and cultural prescriptions. You could think about the work of Botticelli and Eckstein, and how they talk about how Judaism promoted the acquisition of human capital and can explain their early success. It can restrict access to certain occupations. For instance, how money lending was restricted under Catholicism, and Becker and Pascali in recent work in the American Economic Review show how, once Protestantism occurs and Protestantism does not put these restrictions on money lending, you observe a rise of hate crimes against Jews because, the Protestants were unhappy with the Jews competing with them in the money lending sector. And we can also think about the fact that, religious networks can provide important public goods and social networks, and they can be important for both majority and minority groups. The question, obviously, identifying the impact of religion on socioeconomic status is not straightforward. Typically, religion is not, for instance, you might say, it's not something like race. Even in race, you could talk about, the phenomena of passing as white, but it's not an identity that people change so often. So, and at the same time, your religious identity is correlated with several unobservables, right? There's often stratification across religious lines. So how much has it to do with all these background characteristics of individuals relative to the role of religion in itself is kind of hard to pass out, right? And that's where our setting, which is going to be India, is going to provide a kind of a unique setting. Like I was mentioning, all caste groups all major religions exhibit caste cleavages in India, right? So what we are going to be able to do is we're going to look at whether the religious affiliation of the group or the stigmatized caste and provide direct evidence on return to religious identity within groups that are otherwise similar. Yeah, it's going to become slightly clearer in a second.
Sorry.
Yeah.
When you say all religions have caste cleavages, that means there's a caste system within every religion, like even Muslim or Christians.
Exactly. In the South Asian continent, if you would look at it, you would see that for Christianity and Buddhism, certainly in India, almost 90 odd percent of all Buddhists are converts out of former Dalits. Christianity, again, a large share of them are converts out of former Dalits. So these people converted to Islam or Christianity because of the belief that in itself these religions have no caste-like caste system in it, but they remain alive, these practices. There's a large body of ethnographic work which shows not only in the context of, say, India, but even if you look at a place like Pakistan, for instance, today, who are the main community who still act like sweepers in Pakistan are Christian converts who were lower caste Hindus before. So in that sense, caste does not exist. That was the reason that these groups opted out, but they remain identified to an extent with their caste group. That's why, so in the data that we're going to look at, individuals are going to report their religion and they're going to report their caste. Exactly. And that's how I'm going to be able to identify who is a Dalit or not. Okay? And more importantly, maybe now is a good time to just tell you, so scheduled caste, they are called scheduled caste because they were put into a schedule of the constitution. These were a list of groups that were to be afforded affirmative action. I'm going to show you what were the criteria, and these groups together are called the scheduled caste. But there are about, in total in India, there are about 3,000 castes or jātis. This is the right word in the Indian context to use. And this is what determines, who do you marry, who are your insurance networks, and forms the basis of your social life. So I'm going to be able to exploit data, and I'm going to be able to look at individuals. I'm going to hold constant always this jāti that individual belongs to, and then always look within the same jāti. But I'll stick to it, and I'll come back to that question, to that aspect in a minute. So,
are there other ways of upward mobility in the caste structure, like marriage or something like that?
There's no possibility of upward mobility for a woman. In some sense, there could be, because suppose a woman was to marry a person who was of a higher caste, the child is going to take the caste of the father. Yeah. But the other way around, the child is going to take the caste of the father again. So there is, in that sense, an implicit possibility of mobility. But otherwise it's prescribed by birth. And if you would look at, let's say, the last round of data or from nationally representative data on which we have information, like the 2011-12 Indian Human Development Survey, which asked people about intercaste marriages, and you can plot this for 50 years, it hovers at about 6%. Yeah?
What about education and
Of course, you can. Of course, that's going to be a key aspect of way in which you can gain mobility, but that doesn't change your caste per se. So, of course, you could say the impact of my caste identity is going to become less relevant the higher up I am in society. That's true, but you could look at a huge body of literature which also looks at people who enter into prestigious universities in India on the basis of affirmative action and the kind of harassment, mental stress, stigmatization these people still face, despite the fact that they're now inside some of the most premier institutes in the country, suggesting to you that even if you would reach that level, right, which is a very small proportion of people in the entire country, you still carry the stigma of caste with you. You can diminish the role of it, but can you completely escape it? It's not clear. Yeah.
So just thinking about the external validity of this to like other contexts, like I think in many other cities and contexts as well, like intra-ethnic marriages are preferred without the whole caste system and whatnot. So to what extent and how should we think about whether this is like a religious identity per se, or is it about the formalized system of caste in India that makes it a little bit more challenging for people to have an upward mobility and whatnot?
No, sorry.
I'm just thinking of the caste system as like a sort of like a formal system, like a formalized, legalized, codified into the constitution, whereas like in other contexts as well, like, there's still preference for intra-ethnicity and whatnot, and people bonding within the whatever the cultural group, right?
So, endogamy basically is what you're referring to, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, so that's one feature of the structure. You might also say, hey, also lots of other different kind of ethnic groups have prescriptions that are associated with certain occupations. That's what caste is basically defined by, your hereditary occupations. And then the question you're asking is it the case that how does caste make it more difficult as compared to overcoming your ethnic barriers in some sense? Let me come back to this question at the end of it, and I will make some aspects as to why I think there are similarities in some sense, but there are certain distinctions in the way we think about it. Yeah, but I'll hold on to that question and come back to it. Yeah. Okay. So here we are basically asking, can minority ethnic groups reformulate their identities in order to take advantage of opportunities designed to their group? Basically coming back to what Akash was suggesting, in some sense, the fact that if you step out of Hinduism, the idea was, hey, I'm entering into a new religious group that doesn't have these kind of caste-based divisions among them, and I can lose my stigmatized identity to a certain extent. Did it achieve this intended objective that these groups were looking to achieve? Yeah?
Sorry, can you go to the third point? So I'm curious, do Indians can they actually change their last name?
Yeah, in India you can. There will be lots. So you can think there are lots of names like Kumar, Singh. They're all often can be also adopted as very generic caste names. Yeah, then it's very hard to know what group you belong to, and that could be an effective strategy in an urban kind of setting, right? To escape your caste affiliation in a immediate way. You don't have to carry your caste surname. Physically, people are largely indistinguishable in terms of caste.
And the ID doesn't have anything.
No, so the only thing is to be able to. So India has an extensive affirmative action program, right, which are directed at these stigmatized groups. To be able to avail of these affirmative action programs, you need to take a caste certificate. Okay, you have a caste certificate which states what's your caste. Do you belong to the group that has been included in the schedule in the constitution? And that's why it will say, yes, you are a scheduled caste. And consequently, then you can have access to higher education, government jobs on a more preferential basis. Okay, so in these organizations, once you use them, in some sense, your identity is revealed. In terms of thinking about another important reason is this is only 2011-12 data, but if you look at marriages in India, more than 90% of marriages are arranged, and more than 80%, I don't remember, women state that they met their husband on the day of the marriage. Okay? This could have gone down slightly, but if you take a nationally, so basically I'm saying when you're going to marry, these family networks are all important. So again, caste is going to come to the picture. Even if I might have changed my name to Kumar, when I approach somebody for a marriage, there is going to be this family history demanded. That's how family people are going to match on the marriage market. So again, it's going to become kind of very hard to hide your identity in some sense. Yes.
So the reason that certain caste groups are sort of stigmatized in society, they're disadvantaged, is because of discrimination, right? So so how does this discrimination sort of operate? Are there sort of outward identifiable characteristics that you can certain how are people from certain castes identified? Is it through family?
I'm just coming to it, and then if it doesn't answer, I'll show you a table from the Constitution as to what were the characteristics on basis of which people were identified as which group should gain affirmative action, and you will see the criteria are social. The social is very strongly related to the economics later on. But in a village setting, people just know who you are. Yeah, which groups you belong to. Yeah, and like I was saying, in an urban setting, it's possible for you to escape it to a certain extent over time. But conditional on these constraints, like I was telling you, when you want to match on the marriage market, then what happens, right? Then it becomes harder to hide your identity in some sense. So here I don't get into the small toy model in the paper, but you can think about it that as long as it returns to community assimilation, right? Why do you want to become more part of a group, right? Because that gives you psychic, instrumental, and non-instrumental benefits. But if these benefits are decreasing in the level of stigmatization, right? Then groups lower down are more likely to convert out of Hinduism, right? So you can imagine, because even within these Dalits, there is a hierarchy of occupations in some sense. So you could imagine that if anything, selection is operating negatively, but just keep hold on to this thought. Yeah. So
can I think of an alternative explanation?
Yeah, of course.
What about the cost of practicing religion? Hinduism is quite expensive, especially when you are suffering, because Hinduism asks you to sacrifice a pigeon, and then once the pigeon doesn't work, you sacrifice a chicken. If chicken doesn't work, you sacrifice a goat, then a bull, right? Whereas sort of the Christian mission expansion has been more about the transfer from the church to the people as opposed to the other way around, right? So there might be an economic motive to transfer out of Hinduism that has nothing to do with caste or.
Well, then you should have observed that, I agree with you, but then you should observe that within these other religious groups, that there are, and so if you would look, so why do we observe? So you would, in Muslims, you do see there are a wave of Muslim converts who are not former Dalits, who did it for upward mobility reason during the rule of the Mughal Empire. Okay. Similarly, when you look at Kerala, for instance, way back already in the first AD, there are a set of Brahmin converts into Christianity, like Arundhati Roy's group, right? If you look at everything in the 20th century, these are all stigmatized groups that stepped out of Hinduism, right? So if the economic costs also sharply vary by your caste, then your explanation would hold, but then the story doesn't change so much, right? But we don't observe in the data, except for these early periods of when Portuguese arrive and or when Mughal Empire is at its height of its power, that there are upper caste converts into these religious groups, which kind of says caste plays a very important role in determining who converts out in some sense. Yeah.
I have another selection story in my mind.
Yeah.
Thinking that it seems to be beneficial for those who are of the high ability to reveal their caste in order to make use of the affirmative actions. But then within the group of the same caste, then you would see that groups that are not able to make use of the affirmative action will be the one who's more likely to convert out. So I'm thinking of maybe it's more of an ability story rather than assimilation.
Yeah, so let me say two things about it. To start off with, now you'll see the strategy that I'm going to use. Maybe let me just jump there. So let me just go through the context and I'll answer your question right there. Yeah, and then the results doesn't matter. Okay, which is what the summary of the. So let's just talk about the context, and then we can see there are going to be this exactly the selection problems. That's the strategy is going to try and account for. The interpretation, we can see whether there's need for some nuance in the way I'm thinking about it and what you're pointing out to, right? Okay, so they are about 17% of India's population. That's more than 300 million people. So, we're talking about the United States here. And there's an affirmative action program directed towards Hinduism. Buddhists and Sikhs also gained access to affirmative action. Buddhists and Sikh Dalits. The Sikhs already in 56 and the Buddhists in 90, because the Indian court decided, the Supreme Court decided these are derivatives of Hinduism according to them, and therefore they also are still could be subject to caste-based practices. On the other hand, Christianity or Islam, according to the court, does not contain any elements of caste, and so if you are a former Dalit convert into Christianity or Islam, you're no longer eligible for affirmative action. Okay? Although even till now, these groups have been claiming that they want access to affirmative action because they have not escaped the stigma of caste. Okay? And like I was mentioning, all major religions in India, more broadly in South Asia, exhibit these caste-like cleavages. So you could look inside the context of Pakistan, it's called Biradari, and then within them, you can see this kind of very strong hierarchies. And like I said, most marginalized groups within Muslims and Christians to escape the caste discrimination are not officially included in the official SC list. People self-report as being Dalits. Yeah. Okay, going back. Who was supposed to get affirmative action? Yeah. These were the criteria. This is from a table drawn from the Constitution. They cannot be served by clean Brahmins, cannot be served by barbers, water carriers, tailors, etc., who serve the caste Hindus. Pollutes a high caste Hindu by contact or by proximity. Is one from whose hands a Hindu cannot take water. Is debarred from using public amenities. Will not be treated as an equal by high caste men of the same educational qualification in ordinary social discourse. Is depressed on account of the occupation followed, and but for that occupation would be subject to no social disability. Okay, so the main idea around the caste system is this concept of purity pollution. Yeah, a person, these people were assigned to the lowest forms of occupation, which are considered to be polluting by caste Hindus. So working with leather, working with dead carcasses, sweeping, sanitation work. I'm going to show you a list of the groups that are in my data. And so the very fact that you're associated with these occupations makes you polluted, and consequently you cannot engage in any of these activities. Yeah. So even now, if you go to Indian villages or if you look at a recent work, you will see segregation remains quite high. It's not that they live in different villages, they live in different hamlets within the same village. Okay.
Sorry. When was this constituted? Was this a British legacy or?
No, this is from the Indian Constitution. Yeah, exactly. This is 1950s. Yeah, the criteria for inclusion of people as SC. Mm-hmm.
And has some of this been updated since then? Because I think number 5 probably does not apply anymore, right, to anyone. The Constitution.
Yes, none of these apply anymore. But these were the criteria, or these were the practices to which the groups that have been selected were subject.
In 1950.
In 1950.
And that has remained static since then.
The set of groups, yeah. There has been some changes over time, basically to harmonize state lists.
Okay.
Yeah. Not because some groups were included in their states drew it up, and then in Punjab, for instance, certain groups were extended because they were gaining affirmative action across the border, but not in Punjab, and so forth. So there was harmonization of state lists. So there's been some changes over time, but those were the criteria that were followed to say these are the groups that are former Dalits, basically. Yeah. Okay. And like I said, so it's estimated 87%, for instance, of Buddhists are converts out of Hinduism. Yeah, rest are ethnic Buddhists. So large share of them are former Dalits converting to Islam, and it's become illegal in many states now since the new government has been in power. And overall religious composition has remained fairly stable in India. Okay. Okay. So before I move on to thinking about how am I going to estimate the effect of religious affiliation, yes, please.
Right question.
Yeah.
How does the state make conversion into a different religion illegal? Like, what does it mean?
So right now in all these states, there is a law which says that, conversion, unless it's carried out completely, has some kind of language about complete volunteerism, and if there is any kind of inducement, it's illegal. So largely in all these states for effective practices, right, it's illegal now. So if you convert, you are subject, the person who engaged with you in this conversion practice is legal for criminal charges.
Right. It's basically like in the US, you punish the doctor for conducting the abortion.
Exactly. So, and in theory, you can't convert to Hinduism, right? You can't become a Hindu through conversion. But the Hindu right groups and fundamental groups, the right-wing Hindu groups in India have been claiming we want to do what's called a Ghar Vapasi, homecoming ceremony for all these people, because they were all Hindus and they've converted out. So if it's fine with them, we can re-bring them back into the Hindu fold. That's allowed because they were Hindus in any case, and now they have lost their way and became Christians and Muslims and blah, blah, and they can be brought back. There's not such animosity against the Sikhs and the Buddhists because, yeah, people think of them, I mean, Hindus and Sikhs have had conflicts, right? But not per se with Buddhists so much, yeah.
So technically, they could practice the religion, let's say, but they just cannot do it legally. Is that correct? So,
Yeah. I mean, and if you look at, there's a lot of ethnographic research on Christianity among Dalits, and you could see, or Islam, and you could see how there are so many practices from Hinduism that people just import into these religions, right? But even now, you can see, even as recent as 5 years ago, like reports from South India, where, Christian converts complaining that they are not allowed to go into the temples, into the churches, that there are separate churches for high caste converts and low caste converts. So.
But Buddhism is not subject to this restriction in those states.
Sorry?
In those states that don't allow the switching, Buddhism is still allowed. Switching to Buddhism is still allowed.
It's not the most contested one. Yeah, like I said, because the people who are fighting against conversion, afraid of losing the mass of Hindus, although we are a billion of us, is that because they consider Buddhists to be derivatives of Hinduism. They're not a threat to Hinduism.
So people who do switch to Buddhism are not subject to any legal repercussions?
In theory, it is up to the way the law is written, you can be subject to it. Yeah, but it depends upon the interpretation of the law in some sense. So it's conversion is prohibited. It doesn't say conversion to which religion is prohibited, right? It's a bit like, you can talk about it's a bit like who India wanted to give citizenship to, like refugees. They said all minority religions from our bordering countries can have it. So Christians or Muslims can't get it because, they have other places to go and live comfortably. Huh? They should stay in Bangladesh, Pakistan, whatever, where they are majorities.
The CAA Act, right?
Sorry?
The CAA Act.
Exactly.
Might be the other one.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
One small question.
Yeah.
So your SC certificate that you mentioned.
Yeah.
So to get that certificate, you need to satisfy both the caste criteria and the religion criteria.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. Because if you don't, that's the only way you are included. Exactly. Okay, just to descriptively first see, so you could take the last round of the National Family Health Survey, which is over 1 million households, and there are about 300,000 SE households in it. You could just say, hey, forget selection right now. Do you see distinctions between groups within the Dalits, right? And that's what I'm plotting here. You can see descriptively a very clear pattern. The Muslims consistently always do worse, followed by the Hindus, and the Buddhists and the Christians do much better in terms of human capital outcomes. Okay? You could look at health-related outcomes. Again, you observe a similar pattern. These are stunting outcomes. Again, the Muslims even do worse than the Hindus, but they are at the bottom, both of these groups, and Christians and Buddhists do better. These are share of children who are stunted. Overall, the country does pretty poorly. Short stature women, women who are less than 145 centimeters in height. And again, you observe, the Christians also don't do so great, but again, the Buddhists do the best. You could look at assets. So what are the share of households who are in the bottom 2 quintiles of the wealth distribution? And you can see about 50 and 50% of the Hindus and Muslims, and goes down to about 30 and 21%. But flip the picture and ask how many of the people are there in the top wealth quintiles, right? And you see only 28 and 29% of Hindus and Muslims, whereas 36% of Christians and 57% of Muslims. Okay, so you see there are, descriptively speaking, human capital, health, economic outcomes. There seems to be a kind of clear pattern with Hindus and Muslims, and in some cases, the Muslims doing even worse than the Hindus, and Christians and the Buddhists doing better. Okay? So, what are we going to do? I'm going to use 3 data sets: the National Family Health Survey, the Indian Human Development Survey, and Center for Monitoring Indian Economy data set. Why do I? These are the only 3 data sets which are nationally representative and have information on the caste. By caste, I mean this group that they belong to. Yeah. And why is that important? Because that's the relevant social unit that determine your traditional occupation and consequently whether you are stigmatized or not. Your marriage practices, as well as Munshi points out in a series of papers, they are the basis of your business, risk, and insurance network. And in fact, goes on to argue, why do we observe such low inter-migration rates within India? Because individuals don't want to move because they end up losing their caste networks when they move too far away. Okay? So this allows, so what am I going to do? So I'm going to start off with estimating models with Jāti fixed effects. Okay? So I'm going to say, just to make clear, for instance, say these are the top 10 schedule caste Jātis by sample size across data sets. Okay? So what am I going to, so see, these are some of the groups that are there present. So for instance, think about Valmikis, they were a group that were traditionally involved in sanitation work. Okay, and there are large numbers of them converted to Christianity, by large, relatively speaking, right? And so we're going to be able to say, hey, let's look within the group of Valmikis, so include a Valmiki fixed effect, and how do Christian Valmikis look compared to Hindu Valmikis? Or Muslim Valmikis, I know Muslim Valmikis, but how do Muslim Valmikis look relative to Hindu Valmikis? Okay, what is this allowing me to do? As I was mentioning, this group is the one, is your Jāti, and is relevant for all these features. So it's kind of like including an ethnicity fixed effect, right? It's saying, so it's accounting for selection at the group level. So the thing that you were seeing here, they can't be attributed to the fact that, the Valmikis were the better off group to start off with, and Valmikis were the ones who switched to other religions. Okay, because I'm going to say hold constant Valmiki and look within that Jāti or within that caste. Okay, and that's what's going to be my first, and that's going to allow me to account for selection at the group level. Let's come back to selection at the individual level in the next step. Yeah, so that's what it's going to be. The basic workhorse way of thinking about it includes Jāti fixed effects, and let's ask, hey, within the same state, within the same Jāti, do we observe systematic differences in outcomes across these 3 groups?
Sorry, one data question.
Mm-hmm.
When you implement these surveys,
Yeah.
in a way, you ask the religion question first, I assume. That's how I've seen it in the surveys. But if they respond not Hindu, you should skip the Jāti question, right? Technically, because the Jātis are only specific to Hindu. So how does the administration of these surveys work? And what does it mean for the quality of the data, right? Or are you even allowed to ask the Jāti question?
Yeah, you are allowed to ask the Jāti question, but a lot of people can also not respond.
Right.
Yeah, or give very generic answers. Like there are lots of people who I can't look at because they say we are Harijans. Yeah, Harijan was the term given to Dalits that by Gandhi, but was rejected by a lot of the Dalits because they felt it was patronizing and thus not taken up. So, but still, there are a lot of people who report themselves, and people ask them, what is your Jāti? They say, I'm a Harijan.
Right.
Yeah. And there I can't say anything about this group. Yeah. This is a good point. I don't have a good answer to as to how these survey sets, the NFHS, the DHS of India or the IHDS, but at least for the IHDS and CMIE, I can ask, I know the people who run the survey, I could ask them how it worked out, yeah, and to have an answer to that question. I think people implicitly think everybody has a Jāti and then ask them. For instance, because now we did the Modi government has agreed to do the caste census.
Right.
Yeah, and so
it would be important for within group selection if it is the case that there's a skip pattern. And the only people who are responding, the only non-Hindus who are responding to the Jāti question, are people who are still marginalized or they think they are still marginalized.
But then, if anything, then it should kind of have accentuate my effects, right?
So you would have attenuation. So
yeah.
Get to like the true estimate.
Yeah.
See.
And the more important concern would be if it would go the other way, right? It's the better of people who think we have achieved so much that I can now report my jāti with pride, even if it's a stigmatized one, because hey, look, I'm better off than these guys now. And then my estimates would be not an lower bound, but be an upper bound, and then it's a bit more problematic. Yeah.
And just one other thing on the data.
Yeah.
There were a few people who had gotten access to the socioeconomic and caste census of 2011. Asher, Novosad.
Yeah, but there is no outcomes associated with it. Yeah.
I think they were making it publicly available through their website.
Yeah, but you can only then do it at like a unit of village and stuff like they do. Yeah, you can't. It's not. There's no outcomes associated with the individual level data. Yeah, that's why I was talking about that's the segregation paper with Asher and Novosad and all that. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so very straightforward identification strategy then. This is an outcome from individual I, from Jati J, religion R, and state S. We're going to implement the Jati and state fist effects. So like I said, our estimates are thus based on comparing within the same Jati in the same state, but belonging to different religious groups. Okay? And this is going to be the set. So what is the distribution kind of like? Of course, the Hindus are the largest proportion among them. 90% of the samples Hindus, about 2% are Muslims, about 3% are Christians, and 5% are Buddhists and Sikhs. Yeah.
We might get into this later, but how are you doing the identification strategy? Because like people always can choose to change their religion because of the economic motivations or other the upward mobility motivations, and so even within the Jati, there's going to be like.
I agree with you completely, and there will be one more thing that I will do to try and account for this individual level selection, and that's why I was saying that this method only accounts for group level selection. And like you're exactly mentioning, within the Valmikis, there still could be selection that the more upwardly mobile Valmikis are the ones who decide to convert it. Yeah, and I'll come back to this question. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and then there's just some set of very basic controls, age, urban residence, gender. So basically kind of exogenous to you, urban residence, coefficient of interest, the betas associated with the religion dummies. And I'm going to look at outcomes, human capital, assets, occupation, and social stigmatization. Okay. So this, what is it doing? They are showing you there are two sets of standard errors reported everywhere and the two p-values associated with it, because first one is just robust standard errors and the second one are standard errors that are clustered at the level of the primary sampling units. Yeah, because that's the sampling frame for all these and yeah, the relevant maybe level to cluster the standard errors at.
Vice versa. Clustered first, they're bigger.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Okay, so what do you kind of see from this table? So and as like I said, I have 3 different data sets, and the kind of nice thing is they're kind of spanning different points of time, right? So basically, one is from 1988-99, one is from 2011-12, and the other one's from 2019. Almost kind of like 10 years apart, so 30 years of data to see, hey, so one is another point you could think about the surveys are like these are not designed to be representative in any way at the Jati level, right? So that's kind of like, and now I'm zooming into these Jati groups, right? And so using these 3 different data sets and finding very similar patterns also kind of gives you some level of confidence that it's just not a sampling error, like a frame error that I'm just picking up as random knobs, right? But what do we observe? Basically, we observe that the Buddhists do better than the Muslims, Buddhists and Sikhs, about half a year or more of education. The Christians about a year more of education. Varies a bit depending upon the data set you look at. But for the Muslims, you consistently observe that they do worse. Okay?
Can we use this to say something about convergence or divergence? Because there is, I mean, another thing that happened from, let's say, around 2008 or maybe sooner, the large school expansion program, or maybe it was 2003, the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, and similarly the
2006.
2006, yeah. So like, you see sort of the gap increasing between Hindu and the other groups and then decreasing. So these are different surveys. Right?
These are different surveys.
But can we say something about that? That discrimination is being overcome, or
I would be very reluctant to take a very strong stance on it, to look at like the thing that I wanted to look at was our patterns, kind of like the signs and the largely similar. One thing that I wanted to do is I could restrict it to at least the same jātis that are present within the data set. So there are some big groups which are in this across the three data sets, because also the composition of jātis is changing across the three data sets, right? And that maybe holding that constant, I could say a bit more at least about the question of saying is there what is happening over time. But using this table, I would be reluctant to take a comment on it, but I haven't looked at it, but that's a good point. Yeah.
Or maybe just the CMEI, because you have a large enough sample there.
Yeah.
You could probably look at different age cohorts who were.
That's a good idea. Yeah.
Subjected to education expansion, health
So
expansion.
estimation, cross-sectional, open. Is it panel or cross-sectional?
Just 1 second. Let me just note down this point, and I'm coming to your questions. Yeah, that's a good point, because with the CMIE there is a bit of mass to be able to cut with cohorts. Yeah. Sorry, tell me. This is all cross-sectional, right?
1988 and 1999 average.
Because the interview was carried out, these are a survey that was carried out in 1998 and 1999. So some part of the country was interviewed in the end of 1898, and some people were interviewed in 99. Similarly, that's why 11, 12. Yeah, that's the 2 years. India is a big country, these surveys take time. Yeah. Yeah.
Quick question, just what's the age range of the sample? Because like years of education.
These are all restricted to people who are greater than 15 years old and less than equal to 50 years old.
Yeah. Because I'm thinking about the reverse causality, right? Like it's unclear whether you had the years of education first and then you decide like, okay, let me switch to another religion, or it's the other way around, because like I had a different religion, then I.
So we do have like biographies of certain big groups that are driving our results in some sense, and all these conversions are taking place in the past. Okay, I can't look at the data because it doesn't tell me when did you convert, but the big groups that you have, which are the mass of the data, there are detailed histories, and they are all like before independence they are happening largely. It's not to say that small conversions aren't happening along the line. Like the one that I'm going to use the instrumental variable strategy to get around the selection, I can only do it for one big group, and this is going to be the group of Ambedkar, and they're going to convert largely in 1956. Okay, but yeah, that's would be great to know, but I don't have this data. Yeah. So this is 10 or more years of schooling, and again you observe a kind of a similar pattern. Yeah. Why do we pick 10 or more years of schooling? Because that's the minimum level of education that you need to be able to avail of government jobs in the Indian context or affirmative action. Yeah. And then again you observe this kind of a similar pattern. Christians and Buddhists do much better. Muslims do much worse, actually. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So just a quick comment. Like, since your identification strategy here relies on jāti fixed effects, it'd be nice to see or get a sense of what these coefficients look like without the fixed effects, right?
Oh, sure.
So assume they are going down. It's like a presentation perspective.
Yeah.
You know, like which way the bias is.
Yeah. They are going down slightly. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Is there any information about their income level?
There is information on consumption expenditure.
That would be good. Can I add it to it?
Yeah, I mean you find a similar-ish looking picture. They are just much more noisy. They are you would see the same pattern. The standard errors are quite large on it. In the paper we have them in the appendix tables where we include a lot of other variables to see and do some kind of multi-hypothesis testing. But yeah, qualitatively the pattern doesn't look quite different. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And these are asset ownerships. Again, kind of a similar-ish pattern you observe. The the errors are much larger on them. But again, Muslims have fewer assets and Christian and Buddhists have more assets. Okay? And again, you observe the same picture consistently. And the last column, sorry, is like having access to a toilet. And again, you observe you can again look at them by asset, which also we do in the paper, but just to give you kind of a flavor that the pattern remains qualitatively similar across the data sets and over time. Yeah. Okay. What about the effects on social stigmatization? So the Indian Human Development Surveys ask people to report whether they experienced untouchability. For our sample in the data, 19% of them is only available in the Indian Human Development Survey. 19% of Hindus report experiencing untouchability. Muslims, only about 4% of them do. Yeah, so it's a sharp fall there. For the Christians and Buddhists, also slightly lower, but not so much. Yeah. So one benefit that the Muslims, even if their economic outcomes have been poor, one benefit that the Muslim community seems to have obtained as a result of switching religions is that they experience much less untouchability, at least. Yeah. Occupation, you could look at also. So basically, what am I plotting here? Share not laborers or construction workers. They make up more than 70% of the occupation that people in India are involved in. Why is this an interesting break? So if you look at it, median income in all other occupations is about 90,000 Indian rupees. This is from 2011-12. It's about 52,000 rupees for the two categories of labor and construction worker. Okay, so you can see that only 27% of Hindus who are not laborers or construction workers. For Muslims, it's even low, only 10% of them are not. For the Christians, 37% of them are not. And for the Buddhists, about 30% of them are not. Okay, and so again, so assets, occupation, social stigmatization, education, you find this kind of a consistent pattern where the Christians and Buddhists do better. The Muslims do worse, except in the indication of social stigmatization. The Muslims seems to have also, groups have also seem to experience this benefit. Okay, so coming back now to in the last 10-12 minutes, so like I was telling Daniel, Jati fixed effects accounts for the concern of selection at the group level. However, there remains the concern that within the same Jati, individuals are more likely their ancestors who convert are positively selected, right? To address this concern, what I'm going to do, I can't do something for the whole country. I'm going to take a particular group for which I can hopefully implement a credible instrumental variable strategy. And I'm going to consider the case of Mahars from Maharashtra. Who are the Mahars? The Mahars are traditionally a group that were involved with activities such as being a village watchman, wall mender, educator of boundary disputes, street sweeper, and remover of carcasses. This is the group of B.R. Ambedkar. He's the one, as I was mentioning, the architect of the Indian Constitution, spearheaded the extension of affirmative action for the SCs, went to Columbia, got his law degree, came back, became involved in the independence movement, had a lot of quibbles with Gandhi, had to give up his claim for separate electorates because Gandhi went on a big hunger strike, and until Ambedkar agreed to Gandhi's demand that there would be separate seats, but not separate electorates for the Dalits in political representation. He'd also been contemplating for more than a decade about which religion to convert to. Both Islam and Christianity he kind of ruled out because of the kind of baggage they brought with them. The fact that Christianity was concerned or connected deeply to colonialism, and that Islam also had its own entwined history with India. So for a long period of time, when he writes the Annihilation of Caste, even then he is debating what to convert to. And one of the main points he makes, of course, in the Annihilation of Caste is that it's not going to be impossible to annihilate the caste system unless we have endogamy in India. What's the opposite of endogamy? Not have endogamy in India. There has to be cross-caste marriages for the caste system to break down. So after contemplating for a long time, and finally he decides to convert to Buddhism in a massive ceremony at Nagpur on 14th October 1956, and he dies in December of 1956. He, in his essay, when he talks about his speech that he gives when he decides to convert, he also makes clear that the choice of Nagpur was chosen because of the beliefs and the origins of Buddhism. And in the Naga Empire, there were the non-upper caste empire rulers in this part of India, and that's why he decides Nagpur will be my point of conversion. So what do? We do something similar to Becker and Boozman and say, hey, we're going to use the distance from your Nagpur related to the district that you live in to be able to estimate, a distance measure, with the idea being the closer you were to Nagpur, the more likely you were to be influenced by this large mass ceremony that happened with more than 1 million people converting, and you were more likely to convert. And then we come back to look at the exclusion restriction. Okay, so that's the basic idea. Okay. The exclusion restriction amounts to the assumption that the only channel through is the distance of district from Nagpur matters for socioeconomic outcomes is through increasing the probability of adopting Buddhism. To prove this assumption, we also test if distance to Nagpur matters for other jātis in Maharashtra. Okay. Okay, so how does that look like? Again, I have these 3 data sets, right? And I can use, and I'm showing you the results here, again, clustered and robust standard errors. And of course, this can only be done for the Buddhists because Mahars converted to Buddhism. Just looking at the panel, first stage results, you can see that the log distance to Nagpur is indeed extremely strong instrument. Yeah, the closer you were to Nagpur, the more likely were you to convert to Buddhism. And using that to predict the probability of being Buddhist, you see that you get large effects, right? Increases educational attainment anywhere between 1 to 4 years. That's very large effect, but yeah. And yeah, exactly. So that's kind of like a baseline estimate for when you look at this. Sorry?
What's the number of observations for this analysis?
We didn't report them here. They are about, for the CMIE, there are about 4,000 odd people. For the IHGS, there are about 500 odd people. And for the NFHS, about 1,000 people. Maybe for the CMIE, even higher. I forget. I'm surprised I didn't have the number of observations here, but it's something along that line, yeah. But I don't, yeah. But the IHTS is about 500 people, and these are like the late thousands, like 8,000, 9,000. I don't know the CMI and the NFHS in the early thousands, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Are these people only close to 1956, or is it the whole sample?
The people is the entire sample of Mahars, no? I mean, you can also look at it here. I'm thinking you will see the sample size. Wait a second, because there's a 899, 664, 23,000.
Right.
Yeah.
But then are we saying that the 1956 Nagpur effect still persists? And
But I don't know when these people converted, right?
Right.
Yeah.
But then, like, a 15-year-old in 2019
Yeah.
was born in 2004, which is very far away from.
But I'm Buddhist because my parents are Buddhist, then.
Okay.
Right?
So
Exactly.
we're assuming that they converted. If they converted around that.
Exactly. This is the assumption. Exactly. Mm-hmm.
Do we actually see? Can you actually see like what the religion status is throughout that region, or
in what sense?
Just to have a sense of when do people actually convert? Like how relevant is Buddhism in that area?
Well, I can look at it for these 3 sets of points of time. I guess I could take censuses and calculate what are the proportion of Buddhists in Maharashtra for the census rounds that I have. It will give you a sense of how stable is the composition. But like I was mentioning, there, like, largest proportion of them are these Ambedkarites who converted out, but I could see whether there is a growing share or it's relatively flat. The Pew report, I think, that I was citing was just for the entire country, but I could look at it specifically for just Buddhists in Maharashtra and be able to say something. That's possible, yeah. I can't say whether they are Mahars or not, but largely speaking, all the Buddhists in India are Mahars. at least if I would restrict it to Maharashtra. Mhm. So now you could ask, hey, what would happen if I was to exclude what is the kind of, is the exclusion restriction being met here? Does distance to Nagpur matter? One way you could actually check this is exclude the Mahars, right? And say, hey, what's the correlation between your log distance to Nagpur? And here I'm just showing you for the years of education, right? And you observe that if anything, right, in two of the data sets, the coefficient is in fact positive, right? Going the other way. And in all cases, yeah, it's in fact turns out to be even significantly positive. Here's the only case when it's negative, but it's very far from being statistically significant, right? So that's one way of arguing, yeah, it's not that your distance to Nagpur matters for other reasons for these Dalit groups, because when you exclude the Mahas, you don't observe any kind of correlation between the outcomes that you care about. Yeah, you could do the same thing for the other results I showed you, and you get a very similar pattern through these instrumental variable strategies. Yeah. So I was hoping to have, I did have a table, but I'm not showing it today. But so basically, that's a large question. That, of course, one important question, and I'll come back to take some of the empirical questions about the credibility, assuming we believe in these results. So then the next question, of course, that we want to answer is, why do they do better? What is the role? Why are Christians and Buddhists doing better? There's one paper which shows that, individual districts which are located closer to Christian missions have higher levels of education. So one way in which one enticement for people to convert to Christianity was access to educational public goods that was being provided. So that could explain the reason that the Christians seem to do better in terms of the educational outcomes. Similarly, for the Buddhists, many local and regional education trusts and NGOs were set up by the followers of Ambedkar Buddhism. And this could be one implication of looking at it. So one thing that we're working on right now is kind of trying to put together some kind of proxies for access to public goods to see whether that kind of helps explain some of the effects we are finding. This is some analysis I have done, but nothing very clear emerges when I was looking for changes in network. Are you more connected to people outside your caste when you step out of Hinduism, but the data doesn't have any clear patterns? What about channels relating to self-esteem and reduction of other caste norms? And again, we can look at some things like intercaste marriage, the probability that you eat meat, which kind of shows the fact that you become less adherent to caste-based norms once you step out of Hinduism. But yeah, I think I'm kind of tight in time now, and I can take some questions and also maybe come back to some of the remarks. But yeah, just to conclude, yeah, members of a marginalized group can potentially alter the stigmatized status by changing their religion. Religious conversion does not guarantee escape out of stigmatization. Concerted affirmative action or protective policies seem to reduce the severity of marginalization even after conversion. So the case of SC Muslim illustrates an important aspect that, if members move to yet another stigmatized group, because after the independence, the partition and the kind of bad blood that rose between the Muslims and Hindus in the context of India resulted in the fact that, they are one of the most socioeconomically disadvantaged groups in India today. And consequently, your marginalization can get compounded because not only now do you suffer from a stigmatized caste identity, but you suffer from a stigmatized religious identity in the context of India. Okay, so I will stop there and come back to take some questions. So one thing is, in terms of just to remark on thinking about the difference between, I would say there are lots of parallels. One important distinction is that how do you, in terms of moving out of your stigmatized ethnic status, it's not to me very clear what would you do, right? It's not like I'm a Hausa and I decide I want to become take up another ethnic identity in Nigeria, that I can so easily do so, right? Is it the case that if Hausas were to convert to Christianity, they could take up the alternative identity? I'm not so sure about it. Yeah, but that's a question that I should give more thought to in terms of like seeing what's the distinctions and commonalities in terms of drawing a larger picture. Yeah.
What about those that want to come out of this stigmatized caste system? What if they were able to go out of the country, study overseas, raise their income status, come back to India? Do they still regard them as lower caste? Remember, two things has taken place: education, income, come back. Do they still look down on them? That's another way to escape.
Of course, that's another way to escape. But I mean, you can imagine the fact that, you know, even in the United States, a few years back, you know, cases were filed against big IT companies by employees demanding that caste be included as a basis of discrimination in the United States, because lots of Indian immigrants from lower caste groups to these big IT firms complain that, you know, the people in power who are from India and higher caste still discriminate against us. So, and I don't know if the court has included it or not so far, or whether that went up to a decision-making process, but there was a lot of talk about how caste needs to be identified as a, so yes and no, I would say. I think improving economic mobility and education clearly shields you against some of these effects, but it doesn't seem to suggest that it allows you to escape it completely.
Because it increases the chances of marrying from the other class.
Yeah.
Once you have money, you're educated, you can marry from Of course, it's not certain, but it increases.
Yeah. Although, within the context of India, you see that they still remain extremely low intercaste marriages and remain flat. Although incomes of SCs are relatively, there's also, so it depends on how you, absolutely they have done better. Relatively, it depends on which indicator you cut it. But yeah. Yes.
So I wonder if this will either help your strategy or break your strategy.
Yeah.
Like, it's possible that, you know, the effect of networks and the religion accumulate over generations, right? Like, you know, let's say like your grandparents converted way back when, and then you eventually accumulated more networks when you're more assimilated into that. So can you see whether the effects are actually increasing over time across the cohorts? Because potentially, like, you know, the cohorts that had been converted like a long time ago, they would get.
Yeah, this is kind of like what Akash was suggesting that could be possible to do with the CMIE data, because there's maybe sufficient observations for the big groups that I could cut them by at least say 2 or 3 big sized cohorts and see how do these estimates look like over time by age of the individual, and then hopefully and could link them to some groups which we can say, hey, ethnographic evidence suggests these are the time periods in which they converted, largely speaking, and whether there's some distinctions based on, like, as he was saying, is there convergence, is there divergence? But yeah, I hope that I'll cut the data and see whether something shows up there. But yeah, that's possible.
The other comment is another channel that where religious identity could play a role is, like, you know, aspiration constraints, because you know, for example, let's say if the religion teaches me like I can be whoever I need to be and what not, that gives me a little bit of an aspiration that I can improve my social mobility, for example. But then maybe there are certain religions that will teach you, like, okay, you are given your lot in life, and that's how you're supposed to live your life, right? And then that gives you that more constrained relationship. I don't know how to test this out, but like that could be another channel.
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, and I'm also not sure. I mean, IHDS does have some kinds of much more social kind of questions rather than kind of like these kind of your beliefs about mobility and stuff. But I can have a look, but that would be kind of cool to test as a mechanism, without doubt. Yeah. Mhm.
Going back to Daniel's point earlier on the external validity.
Mhm.
So the Ambedkar Mahar analysis does something to, say that, look, it's really the switching that matters.
Yeah.
Right? Or it helps you to some extent get over the individual level selection.
Yeah. Mhm.
in Jati.
Yeah.
But also there's another story there, right? Like how much of that is just Ambedkar effect, or the Mahar effect, because
They're a particular
many-
group.
how many group leaders of particular or specific jatis were framers of the constitution, right? So there is, and Ambedkar is a name that everyone knows, right? So
Yeah, I agree.
would it hold for a Dalit caste in Uttar Pradesh, for example? Right.
Hard to so one thing is that, of course, by the time Ambedkar converts, and the duration to his death is a matter of few months.
Right.
Yeah, so he can't have been directly galvanizing the people to improve their outcomes. But that said, it does not matter, because the legacy of Ambedkar's name
Exactly.
still stands, right? So that's yeah, I'll have to think very hard to come up with a way of getting around for some other group which is not so important.
Right.
Maybe like the Balmikis, in Punjab, when like in the 20s they converted in large shares. Is there some way, is there some geography to this conversion? I don't know, right?
Or maybe there is a Mother Teresa effect in Calcutta, I don't know, but just to get some more external validity.
Yeah.
The Ambedkar effect might itself be quite strong, right?
Yeah, that's true. And at this moment, yeah, like I said, it takes around this the selection effect, individual selection effect, but even the external validity to other jatis in India. Yeah, it's a fair point. Don't have a. Yeah, I was just always. There are some other groups I could do these exercises for, but I'm just not sure if I keep to add more groups like these case studies. Does it help my case much more? And that should be where I should put more of my effort, or thinking about mechanisms would be more useful. But yeah, maybe one more group which doesn't have this famous leader could be kind of nice, but then I don't know what would be a good instrument to do so. But yeah.
Then we have one questions from online participants.
Yeah, sure.
Sriram, please go ahead.
Yeah. So I also see that RSS headquarters also was in Nagpur since 1925. So it could also be the case that, as you probably know, that RSS is a lot of people might be maybe changing caste because of negative feelings about RSS, or because of Ambedkar, we are not sure. Because I think RSS has a headquarters since 1925 in Nagpur as well.
That's a good point, Sriram, and I didn't know this. But one thing is that you don't. So then it should not be the case that only the Mahars switch, right? It should be the case that it should be applicable to the other Dalit groups also that live in Maharashtra. And you don't observe either a first stage or a second stage for the other Dalit groups in Maharashtra. And that's why it kind of suggests to me that it's more an Ambedkar rather than a RSS effect. But yeah, thanks for that. I can think deeper about it. But
and also Mahar actually is actually if you see even the BJP and RSS have in the last few decades have co-opted Dalits. That's why they are winning. So Mahar group is one group which is very very anti-RSS and BJP, but there are other Dalit groups which have been co-opted, because ultimately even like the upper caste divide and conquer strategy they still use, right? So even among the Dalits there are certain groups which are very anti-RSS BJP. And some groups are co-opted.
yeah, I mean, I have to see which are the co-opted groups, to be honest, and think about what kind of tests could be done with them to be able to distinguish whether this kind of alignment or non-alignment helps them. But yeah,
maybe you could also look at some other states where the percentage of the percentage of the Buddhist population is quite high or somewhat high, right? In Maharashtra, it's around 6%.
yeah.
In Sikkim, it's probably more than 20, but Sikkim probably is not the right state.
Yeah, because they are not
yeah,
Dalit converts, they are STs.
yeah, yeah. So there could be some states in the mainland you could use some other jati, and if that also comes, that makes your case more stronger, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, or otherwise I could just do these table excluding the Mahars and see what happens, right?
Yeah,
true. Whether you observe, and first I should check how many Buddhists are there who are non-Mahars in my data. And then I could exclude if there are a small proportion, at least qualitatively, at least I could exclude and see whether the results still survive or they're being principally driven only by the Mahar Buddhists. Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But again, but like the data source also I quoted, which says that 90% of Buddhists are converts, Ambedkarites. But yeah, it's worth checking.
So another meta comment is like, how is identity formed, and whether it's, like you get your identity from like generationally transmitted from like your parents or like your religious groups, cultural groups and whatnot. So you're almost like given that identity, or people create their identity in life and then, or shop around for their identity in life. I don't know which definition of the identity would be best suited for this analysis.
I would somehow say the first, because I think, and again, I can only say I think because I can't bring data to it, that most of the people who we are looking at in the data are not converts themselves. I think they are converts because their ancestors converted. And looking at this generational thing can maybe help shed some light about what you're saying, like, do the effects increase over time, decrease over time, remain stable over time, which also tells you something about like investments that might be happening into your identity over time once you decide to become a Buddhist or a Christian, or, there's a novelty. Does it in fact fade over time because, initially you are a Buddhist, but people then say, hey, this Rajesh might be claiming to be a Buddhist, but he's actually, after all, only a Dalit and he should be put in his place. But that's the only way I can think of right now and from the top of my head as to how I could say something about it. Ideally, otherwise you would be able to follow a person over time and be able to say something about identity formation. Yeah.
I think we are past time.
Is it possible to do some qualitative questioning, asking the people directly to see whether there is any change?
Yeah, if you send me some, drop me a small funding box, I could organize a survey in India. That I could.
I know it will cost enough. I'm just thinking this kind of study to also be more impactful if there is a qualitative dimension to it.
Yeah.
It will tell a lot.
It would be nice. Yeah, to learn from the experience of people who converted, to say when did they convert, why did they convert, or at least, I mean, we do a bit of a job in the paper, but I think there could be more done because there are lots of ethnographic work that's been already done looking at certain groups. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, we can continue the conversation over coffee and some snacks outside. But I should bring this to close since we are 17 minutes over.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rajesh.
Thank you.
Very interesting, and I'm sure you'll get a lot of emails. Please do share your feedback. That's the only way we can sustain this this seminar series, if we have enough data to say that this is valued. Yeah.